Greetings everyone and welcome. My name is Alex with the Climate Science Alliance, and today we're going to briefly walk through our Climate Science and Food Systems traveling trunk so you get an idea of what's in it and how you might be able to use it in your classroom. Now, the purpose of this trunk is to really get students and the public engaged with how climate change is impacting our food system and vice versa, how our food system is impacting our global climate. So with that, let's begin. What is in the trunk? First and foremost, as with all of our Climate Kids trunks, we have our curriculum binder. This has everything you're going to need to teach this lesson. As you guys open it up, there is a little pocket, and in that pocket you'll find a USB. This has all of the presentations, all of the curriculum, so you have a digital copy of that. And then as soon as you start getting into the binder, first page tells you the objective of this trunk. Really, like I said, designed to look at climate impacts on the regional scale to our food system, and also to really focus on solutions, right? A lot of our Climate Kids programming is really focused on what can you do to help solve the problem. As you guys go through, you'll see how to use this trunk, what's inside of it. We have our climate primer, which we'll go through in a second, regional climate impacts primer. We have our tribal perspectives module, and then our food systems module, which has our 3 components of all of our Climate Kids work, the hands-on science, storytelling, and art. So that's all in that first 2 sections. You'll have your evaluations if you wish to evaluate your students on what they might be obtaining in this curriculum. We created these for you to use both pre and post surveys, so feel free to make copies of those. And then again, as I said, we have our climate primer with all of the presentations you'll need. We'll go through the different pieces that are in that climate primer today briefly. And then regional impacts module, so how is climate change impacting us here in Southern California, both humans and wildlife, flora and fauna. Our tribal perspectives module, and then finally our food systems module. So let's start first and foremost with the climate primer. What is in the climate primer? As this climate primer is in all of our traveling trunks, and we recommend that any educator who is teaching this curriculum really start here, just to make sure all your students are on the same foundation. So within the climate primer, beyond the presentation that you can start with, there are a couple of hands-on activities that you can do. The first of which is our heat trapping blanket demonstration. So every climate primer has a big inflatable earth that you can throw around the classroom, get your kids really excited about learning about climate change. And then we also have our heat trapping blanket. And this is, of course, a metaphor for carbon dioxide being put into the atmosphere and creating this heat trapping blanket over the earth. Sometimes I like to put the kids under it as well, and they can really get into it. And this is just showing that as that carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, creates that heat trapping blanket around the earth gets warmer, and then we start to have bigger issues. So that's kind of the first activity you could do with your students. We also have 2 other activities within that climate primer. The second of which is our greenhouse gas game. There's some cool cards that you'll have. You'll see this is to show, the purpose of this game is to show the impact of the greenhouse gas molecules. So what you will do is have your students get in a big circle, maybe outside, maybe in the classroom, and each student is going to get a light card, and that's representing the sun shining in to the center of the circle, where you can have a bucket. That bucket can have these heat cards, and basically what that's showing is that the greenhouse gases will be trapping the heat within the Earth's atmosphere. So students get the light cards around the circle, bucket gets the heat cards, and then you're going to have 2 or 3 volunteers. Those volunteers are going to be your carbon molecules. They'll come into the center of the circle, and essentially when you say go, all your light molecules can start to try to come in to then transfer for a heat card. So they'll put their light cards into the bucket and they'll pull a heat card out. Once they have a heat card, they can be tagged by those carbon molecules. So the goal of the game is to really show how these greenhouse gases are trapping the heat within the Earth's atmosphere. And then the third set of cards that we have in this greenhouse gas game, these are kind of how the CO2 or the carbon dioxide molecules, if you want to add or subtract based on human impacts. So for example, this one says humans burn trash, burning waste puts CO2 into the atmosphere along with other pollutants, add 2 CO2 molecules. So in that instance, you would, in the next round of this game, add 2 additional taggers in the middle of your circle, or 2 additional carbon dioxide molecules. And then you run the simulation again, give everyone a light card on the outside of the circle, put the heat cards back in the center of the circle in a bucket or some sort of repository. And then run it again, and you'll see, because you have now more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, more greenhouse gases, that you'll trap more heat. And then you can run it as many times as you want, but the goal is to really get students to understand that with more CO2, more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you get more heat. But then alternatively, there are things you can do to remove the heat. So some of these cards also say, humans are planting trees, so that it's removing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So that's a really good second game of our climate primer. And then the last kind of activity that we have is called the carbon cycle game. So within the carbon cycle, we have a couple of different tools. The first of which is these little fluffy bracelets. I think these are called pipe cleaners, right? So there should be one for each student. And then you have a couple of other tools. You have these sphere cards. So there's one for each sphere: atmosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere. And then you'll also have these beads for each sphere. So here we have the hydrosphere and the lithosphere. And then there is a cube. Lots of different fun toys, but there's a cube for each sphere. And there's also 2 cubes for the lithosphere. And essentially what this demonstration is going to be showing is how carbon is accumulated in the different spheres and how that has changed both pre- and post-industrial revolution. So you have a pre-industrial revolution block and a post-industrial. And so what you'll do is you'll post these sphere signs around the classroom or perhaps outside, and you'll add the tub of pony beads. I recommend that you set the rule that if anyone spills the pony beads, they get to clean them up. You'll put that next to the associated sphere as well as the block. And so what will happen is you'll divide your students with their bracelets around into the different spheres, and they will start by picking up a bead for whichever sphere they're in. And then they will roll the block associated with that sphere, and it will tell them a direction. So they'll either stay where they are, in which case they'll grab another bead, or they might be directed to go to a different sphere, in which they will go and grab the bead from that sphere. And so you'll run the simulation twice. The first time is we'll see with the pre-industrial block that will get the carbon accumulating in a certain sphere or not. And then you can explain halfway through the game, as the students have played one round for about 10 minutes and collected their beads. You'll stop the game, have them make some observations, how many beads they see, predominantly what sphere that they are in. And then you'll explain, hey, post-industrial revolution, we've become really good at taking dead dinosaurs or oil out of the ground. And then we switch this out for the post-industrial lithosphere block, and that they'll run the simulation again, and you will see how the beads change. And it's a really cool way, just for a visual way, to see how carbon is accumulating in the spheres and how our human actions have changed that. Good? Okay. So I'm going to put these back over here, and that kind of gives you a good idea of the climate primer and the different activities associated with it. Like I said, this is just a really great way to introduce your students, perhaps who might not have been introduced to climate change before or understand the carbon cycle. It just kind of gets everyone on the same page. So that's a really great way to start. As we go through our binder, we would go from the climate primer, and then we have our regional impacts module. This module was created in collaboration with the San Diego County Ecosystems Assessment, which was a part of the 4th California Climate Assessment. And so this basically goes through and talks about how are San Diego wildlife and communities impacted by climate change. As we know, climate change is a global issue, but has regional impacts, right? So we might not necessarily get hurricanes here in Southern California, but we definitely get wildfires. So this module explains those pieces to your classroom, whereas we look at impacts of temperature changes here in Southern California, precipitation, covers wildfire, changes in connectivity, as well as impacts to the coastal fog layer. So there's a presentation that's associated with this, as well as a regional impacts activity. We made these fun cards that have the actual regional impacts data associated with the report for each of those primary climate impacts. So wildfire, precipitation, temperature. And then on the back of these cards, it talks a little bit about the species associated or that might be impacted here in this region by that certain climate impact. And so once you've gone through the presentation with your students explaining and giving them background on the different climate impacts, you can divide them up into groups. They each get one of the data cards to look at, to overview, to ask the questions and discuss them in their groups. So for example, with this regional impacts data, precipitation, you have the data for the South Coast of how precipitation has changed over time, looking at what is year on record, what is the driest year, what does the trend line suggest. So it really allows them the opportunity to look at the data themselves. And then on the back, these questions guide them to what does the data mean, right? So it's great that we have these numbers and these graphs, but what does it mean not only for wildlife, but also for human communities? And the thing that I really try to do with classrooms is to get them to think about how this is impacting their own lives, right? Here in Southern California, we are all impacted by these climate impacts. So it really give them a chance to kind of internalize it. How are we being impacted as well? And then most importantly, what we can do to help. So because the San Diego Ecosystems Report is focused on wildlife, we have our 10 things to give wildlife a break, which you can review with your students and give them kind of action items, ways that they can help be a part of the solution. So that's a little bit about that San Diego Ecosystems and Regional Impacts module. And then next we have our tribal perspectives. So this module is a living document where we start to amass different, because we have so many different tribal perspectives in this region and in this in North America, we wanted to have a living document where we could really amass those different perspectives on how climate is impacting the food system. And so you can check that out here in the tribal perspectives, and there's also a associated binder that has a lot of that information as well. So I recommend looking through that. There's some really great activities. This one is specific to this region, but we've also been working to amass other resources as well. So check that out. And then to the primary piece of this trunk is our food systems module. So I'm just going to walk you briefly through each of the activities and how you might incorporate them into your classroom. So again, with each of our trunks, we have the presentation and a little bit of background information so you can read up on the role of the food system in our changing climate and here in San Diego. And that just kind of gives you a good background to preface with your students. And then there's a presentation. Along with all of our presentations, we literally write out what you can say. We recommend that you don't read it, that you actually look through it and make it your own. But if you needed to, you could. And so with this module, we really wanted to take students all the way from the carbon cycle to how climate is impacting the food system, and then how the food system is impacting our climate. So we talk about things like I said, the carbon cycle, how photosynthesis works, and we go through all the way to those different pieces, and then how local producers are working to be a part of the solution. So lots of really cool activities here, and we'll just briefly go through them. The first of our activities is understanding the carbon cycle. And this is actually very similar to our carbon game that we just kind of explained, just in a bit of a different format. So we wanted to make sure that students were aware of how the carbon cycle works, because it's so integral to the food system. So what we'll use is, or for this activity, students are going to illustrate how carbon flows between the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the atmosphere. And we have a slightly different way of doing it for this activity. We still have those same cards. There's actually little magnets on the back, so if you have a whiteboard or a big magnetic surface, you can put these on there. And then the goal is to give them an idea of where carbon is moving through these spheres. So we have a couple of different other tools. This one is kind of the movement, right? The movement arrows of carbon between the spheres. So things like photosynthesis will move carbon from one place to another, respiration, diffusion, all the different ways carbon can move through the cycle, through the system. And then we want to see, we'll have students put those spheres up on the board, and they can predict of where carbon is moving with the arrows. These two are magnetic. And then the important piece here is understanding how humans might be altering these cycles. So we have these carbon cycle alteration cards, things like farming, planting, burning fossil fuels, etc. And they can write each of these carbon cycle alterations onto one of these human alteration arrows. You can just use a whiteboard marker. And then students can place them into their whole diagram just to see how the carbon cycle is being disrupted. And some of them are going to be positive disruptors, some of them will be negative disruptors. So it just gives them a better idea of how carbon is flowing through the system. So that is the first activity. And then we go from there to our second activity, which is just a really fun way to get students looking closely. I think a lot of times our students don't know where our food comes from, or they have never really looked closely maybe at their vegetables or their fruits. So this just gives them a time to really explore with a guided question. So in our traveling trunk, we have a set of these magnifying glasses, and then we also have a set of these Climate Kids plant inquiry cards. And so our hope is that each of the students has a nature journal, or that you've provided them a nature journal, or if not, you can just use paper and pencils. And the goal is to use these cards to really guide their nature journaling experience. So we have a couple of great examples here of some really great observations, nature journals from others. And so what the students will do is they'll take their card, their plant inquiry card. You can either bring some fruits and vegetables into the classroom for them to look at, or if that's not available, you can have them go outside, look at some trees, look at the grass. But it really just is a way to get them to look closer, noticing different things. And so there's like different prompts on these cards, everything from observe and draw your specimen, adding your specimen's name, write descriptions of your specimen. So all sorts of different prompts on this card just to get your students to really look closer at the vegetables and fruits that they'll be exploring. So that's our science activity number 2. And then we go from there to starting to really bring in that climate conversation. So the third activity is called the role of climate impacts on the food system, role being in quotes. And this is a way for your students to understand climate impacts and also how they're impacting the food system, which, as we kind of know, the food system is comprised of many, 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 many different pieces. So each of those pieces we try to capture on one of these cards, whether that be access to food, grocery stores, animal welfare, all sorts of different pieces. And so this is more to open a group discussion for your students. So what they'll do is they will take a roll of the dice, and so they might get something like wildfire, right? So how might wildfire impact our farmers? Maybe that's the card, and you guys can spur on a discussion about that. It's really nice because it's open-ended, and it really gets your students thinking about all these impacts and how they might impact the different facets of the food system. So that is our activity number 3. I apologize, we're going rather quickly. I just want to make sure this is a high-level overview. So from there, we start to look again at climate impacts, specifically in an experiment called the Growing Seeds experiment. So we wanted to give students an opportunity to look at the impacts of precipitation and also temperature, which, as we know, climate change will be impacting as we go forward. And so this next experiment, which I don't have a lot of pieces in the trunk because your students will be doing this themselves, but they will be growing up little seeds. So we recommend you have your students each grow, maybe it's a bean or a seed. You can usually get like a mason jar, or you can even grow, oftentimes you can grow seeds in little plastic bags. So start to grow out a seed, and then you'll be having your students do an experiment on those seeds or those miniature plants as they start to grow up, and giving them 4 different treatment groups. So perhaps one of your student groups will have impacts for regular temperature, high temperature, low precipitation, and high precipitation. So we want to see how the different plants are going to be impacted by those 4 different factors. So we do have a couple, or one tool at least. We have a lamp, a heat lamp, as well as a thermometer, so you can check how hot this is getting. But we recommend that you have those 4 different treatment groups going, so the students can see over time, measure over time, if we give our plant a little bit more water or less water or no water, versus if we change the temperature, whether making it hotter with the lamp or leaving it the same, how that will impact how the plants are growing. And so it's kind of like a small scale version of what you might see on a large scale farm, of how changing temperatures and precipitation is going to impact plant growth, just so we can better understand climate impacts on a larger scale. And just to help you guys out with that, we actually have this experiment worksheet, so the students can make observations based on those different treatment groups, whether it be high temperature, regular temperature, which is the control, high precipitation, or low precipitation. So there's many ways to really run that experiment, but that's just to look at climate impacts to growing of plants. From there, we shift a little bit. So climate change isn't going to necessarily only impact producing plants, but it also impacts other things like water availability, or we have climate impacts to the ocean, so maybe seafood availability. So the next couple activities are really to look at those parts of the food system. So the first one is, or the science activity number 5 is be water aware. And this is where students will just have gain an understanding that fresh water on Earth is limited. And they'll go through a demonstration on how to have best practices to reduce water consumption, and really discuss the need for water conservation and protection related to overall like human population growth and agriculture. So for this, there is a classroom demonstration that you can do either in person or virtually, depending on how you are teaching right now, where you basically get a huge 1-gallon container, and it slowly steps down to how much earth or fresh water, or how much water total is available on the earth, and how much of that is fresh water, how much of that is actually available for human use. There's a couple of different tools. We have a little cup measure and a little dot and dot dropper, and basically what you find is out of that big gallon bucket of water. This dot dropper is what we have available for human use. So a really good demonstration of freshwater capacity. And then there's another kind of video and engaging activity where students can better understand how water is being used and what they can do to help. So great activity there. And then our next activities are looking at ocean acidification. Like I said, there's not just impacts of temperature and precipitation, but carbon dioxide being absorbed into our global oceans also has impacts. So we have two different activities to really get that idea across. The first one is called the shell building game. In your trunks, you guys will see that there are all these awesome bright Legos and that they have little critters glued onto them. They each come apart just like this. And so what this is this is a game to show how changes in ocean acidification conditions can affect the ability of animals to build their shells. And so along with this, you'll find in the trunk two sets of colorful dice. So one of the sets of dice, on these you'll see they have little H's and little CA's, and what those represent is the ratio of hydrogen and calcium in the ocean. So one is current conditions, ratio of hydrogen to calcium, and one is future conditions, ratio of hydrogen and calcium. And so what the students will be doing is looking at, okay, in future versus current conditions, are animals able to build their shells? And so you can divide your students up however is appropriate. Usually I like to put them in teams and give them each a set of these animal building blocks. And everyone will start with the first building block. And so you'll have one team on future conditions and one team on current condition dice. And what they'll do when you say go, they'll roll this dice, and if they get a calcium, they can add another piece of their shell, right? Because the calcium is what's helping build those shells. However, if they get a hydrogen, if they roll the hydrogen, then they cannot add a shell onto the building block. And what you'll see over time is in current conditions, the shells start to build, but in future predicted conditions, the students will have trouble building their shells. And that can really spur a conversation on how this ocean acidification impacts our shells and this part of our food system, right? The seafood piece. So that's a cool demonstration there. And then we also have another ocean acidification demonstration called carbonate and acidic conditions. And this just allows students to make observations based on different levels of acidic seas. This can be done with things that you find in your kitchen. So everyone will get a couple of these little cups, and you'll fill them with different variations, whether it be water or vinegar. And the vinegar will represent acidic conditions. And so you might do one that has half and half water, vinegar, one that has all vinegar, one that has all water. And students can set these up and start to make observations of what will happen. So the first thing when you set your cups up, you also provide pH testing strips. So this allows you to see how acidic the seas are going to be. So we give you these so the students can dip them into the different cups and see using the pH indicator how acidic or not acidic, 2 being more acidic, or 2 on the scale versus 11, which is more basic. So they can test the different strips, make observations, write them in their notebook. And then we also recommend that you provide either chalk or baking soda, and that's going to be to simulate shells, right? Because it's the same basic components, baking soda and shells, just calcium carbonate. And so once you have your acidic seas set up, you can start to sprinkle in the baking soda or the chalk, and students can make observation of what's going to happen to those shells in the different acidic conditions. And you'll find that in the more acidic seas, the baking soda or the powdered shells start to dissolve, and students can make observations and conclusions on what that might mean. Awesome. So now that we've kind of gone over different climate impacts to different pieces of the food system, we can start to move on. So the next activity, number 8, is called the Carbon Cafe demo. And this will help you initiate a conversation about how we make smarter food choices for the health of our environment, and just help your students develop a better understanding of the carbon impacts of some of these foods. So in your trunk or in the trunk, you'll see a bunch of different blocks, just like this. I believe there's 10 different blocks, all representing a different food group, food type. So here we have a spinach block, we have an egg block, we have a meat block, everything from potatoes, bread, noodles. You'll see it all in the trunk. And what this is going to show is each of these blocks is weighted. So whereas the spinach block, that has a relatively low carbon footprint, is way lighter than this 5-pound behemoth, which is the meat or the beef block. And so what you can do is you can set all these up on a table and have students make observations or put them in order, or just feel, right, the difference between the carbon impact or the carbon footprint of each of these different food groups. So a really cool way just to understand how our food choices impact the carbon cycle. From there, we go to different solutions. So a lot of producers are implementing what's now known as climate smart or carbon smart agricultural practices. And we want to make sure that the students are aware of what these are. So we have an activity called Climate Smart Practices. And with this, there's a whole little book. These are laminated cards of the different climate smart agricultural practices and how farmers or producers are trying to lower the impact of carbon into the atmosphere. And so these are things such as no-till or minimum-till farming, controlling for food loss, prescribed grazing, all sorts of different climate smart agricultural practices. And so what we're going to have for your students is to read on the back a little bit about the climate smart agricultural practice, and then synthesize that information on the front. And they're welcome to write on these with the markers, the dry erase markers. And then my hope is that they can present this information to the rest of their classmates. So maybe you guys do kind of a little museum tour around your classroom or whatever works for you. But this is just a way to really understand these different climate smart practices and how we're mitigating the impacts of climate change by either sequestering carbon back into the soil or keeping it from going out into the atmosphere in the first place. So great activity there. And then we kind of go back into the climate footprint or seeing the impact of our food choices or on the atmosphere. And so this next one allows your students to kind of track what different foods have a big carbon impact. And so there's a worksheet for them to write down. Either you can do this one of two ways. If you want to have your students monitor their own climate footprint, they can write what they've had for the past day or week. If you work with students who might be unable to do that, or there's some other equity issues, I recommend collaborating with the cafeteria, and maybe your students can track the footprint of the school cafeteria. It's a really great way to do that. And so there's a website called Eat Low Carbon website, or eatlowcarbon.org, where you can have your students write all the different food items and then look at the carbon dioxide score, and then total it up and see kind of the impacts of these different food choices on the global climate budget. So that's a cool activity. And then the next one is getting your students to really think about, again, their food choices, or researching different fruits and vegetables and foods that are locally sourced and in season to produce climate-smart recipes. So recipes that have low impact on the earth in their given season. So we recommend having your students do that research on local fruits and veggies or locally sourced food products for each of the different seasons. Maybe you divide your students up. Some get fall, some get winter, some get spring or summer. And then they start to, with those researched food products, they can start to make a climate-smart recipe. We have a template here. You can also see an example of this on our Climate Kids website, where we made a Resilient Roots cookbook. So here locally in San Diego, we picked out 4 different recipes that you could create based off of locally and seasonally produced vegetables and fruits. So I recommend check that out as an example. This is a really cool way to get your students involved. And then the last of the science activities for this module is called the Green Earth Catch, and it's kind of just a fun activity to go over all the pieces with your students and see what they've learned. So there's this cool ball called the Green Earth Ball, lots of different questions or trivia on it. For example, here's one that says, what are greenhouse gases, A, B, C, or D? Heat-trapping atmospheric gases, we know that. So yay, we got it right. We can throw this around the classroom as a bit of a trivia or a quiz, pop quiz, just to kind of garner what your students have learned and where the gaps might still remain. So this is a really cool activity for that. And then as with all of our Climate Kids programming, it's not just about hands-on science. We also cover the topics of storytelling and art. So we have a Telling the Stories of the Food System activity. And within this chunk and within all of our chunks, we also provide awesome books. So whether they be our climate books like this one, Buried Sunlight, or we have food systems books like this one, Tricky Treats, or this one, which is The Cooking the Native Way by the Chia Cafe Collective. Awesome cookbook if you haven't read it. We have all these different books for the students to connect with the food system on, provided in the trunk. And especially a couple of the books just looking at how people who work in the food system are impacted by these climate impacts. And so we recommend that the students go through that and really reflect on climate impacts, not just to the food system as it is like in the food, but also to the climate impacts to the people as well. So that's a really great activity for them to look at. And then the final piece of the food systems module is the art piece. And we have a couple of different art activities. The first one is called Illustrated Graphs, and this was inspired by a piece by artist Jill Pelto, whereas she really illustrates this climate data. So as you can see within each of those different lines, those are actual climate data. And this one is obviously representing pieces of fire data, where this one is representing different sea level rise and glacial ice melt. And so we have different data templates for you to use. And so you can look at or have your students draw out some of the data from the food system, how climate is impacting it, and then decorate it appropriately. So it just gives them a different understanding and appreciation for climate impacts to the food systems by really creating this artistic representation. So if your students don't necessarily connect with the data, they might connect to these topics via art. And then we also always want to be a part of the solution. So we recommend for our next art activity that we create these food print solutions posters. So we have this example here where you can create these really cool stamps with food scraps. So things such as apples or maybe the end of a cucumber or an orange. And you can just dip them in paint and stamp them right on. It's really fun, especially for younger kids, but we take this a step further and we really encourage students to make solutions posters. So maybe it's like lower your food waste, and it talks a little bit about different actions that students can take in order to get the word out, right, from all the things that they've learned. So that's a little bit about it on the food systems module. Another thing I forgot to mention earlier that's also included is with each of our chunks, we have a set of posters that you can put up around your classroom. For this module, we have a bunch that focus on photosynthesis and different plant parts. We also have one that explains the whole food system. It's really cool. You can see all the different pieces and how they intersect. And then we also have, as with all of our chunks, the 10 things you can do to protect the earth, and the 10 things you can do to give wildlife a break. And that is because we are making sure that all of our messaging, all of our educational materials are solutions-based, so that we give students and the community tangible actions that they can take to really help, right, to help offset our climate impacts. So I believe that is all the pieces in this chunk. I hope you learned a lot. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us at the Climate Science Alliance, info@climatesciencealliance.org, or you can check out the other virtual resources on our website at www.climatekids.org, and we hope to see you there. Thanks.